Newly released census data shows the United States is growing more diverse. The non-Hispanic white population now makes up more than 57% of the country. That is the lowest share on record, down nearly 9% over the past decade. The 2020 census numbers will be used for redistricting to redraw congressional maps. We are also watching the Food and Drug Administration, which is expected to authorize a third coronavirus vaccine dose for immunocompromised Americans. The booster shot would aid those who may not have gotten an adequate response from 2 doses of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines. On CBS This Morning, Dr. Anthony Fauci addressed the possibility of a third shot for everyone.
It is likely that that will happen at some time in the future because it would be extremely unusual, and we're already starting to see indications in some sectors about a diminution over time. That's durability. We don't feel at this particular point that apart from the immune compromised, we don't feel we need to give boosters right now. But importantly, we are following this in real time.
Plus, new testimony is illuminating just how far former President Trump and his allies were willing to push unsubstantiated claims of widespread voter fraud. The Washington Post reports former acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen said Mr. Trump applied, quote, persistent pressure to try and get the Justice Department to discredit the results of his 2020 election defeat. There's no evidence of widespread issues last November. Despite that, it's now a widely held belief among Republicans. At a fundraiser in Illinois Wednesday night, Texas Republican Congressman Dan Crenshaw was heckled by an attendee insisting the election was somehow stolen. Here's Congressman Crenshaw's response.
This is something you got to accept. Is there a lot of voter fraud?
He is right.
Probably is. Enough that Trump won? No, absolutely not.
You'll see.
Absolutely not. 5 different states?
Yes.
Hundreds of thousands of votes?
Yes.
Kidding yourself.
For more on this, I want to bring in Meridith McGraw and Sarah Mucha. Meridith is a national political correspondent for Politico, and Sarah is a politics reporter for Axios. Welcome. We have a lot of news to get to. Meridith, let me start with you. What does this move of the U.S. sending troops into Afghanistan mean for the Biden administration's efforts to bring the situation there to a close?
Well, I think the speed with which the Taliban has been able to capture and take control of Afghanistan has really been alarming for officials at every level of the government. It's estimated that right now the Taliban controls about 2/3 of the country, and that the Taliban could control all of Afghanistan within the next few months. And President Biden has said that he would be pulling out troops by August 31st, and he said that he does not regret his decision to do so. The U.S. has the expectation that the lives and money and resources that the American people have given over the years, they'll now hand it over to the Afghan military to defend themselves. But so far, they have shown that they have been unable to really defend themselves against the Taliban and this front that they've been putting up. And of course, the next big fear is what's going to happen in Kabul. Could that potentially fall to the Taliban as well? As we heard today, the Pentagon is going to be deploying an additional 3,000 troops over there to help, control the situation. And they said that this doesn't mean that they aren't going to follow through with pulling troops out of Afghanistan by that August 31st deadline. But of course, with the deployment in the next 24 to 48 hours, the big question is how long will the U.S. be able to, help the Afghan people secure themselves there in Kabul before the situation deteriorates even more?
Yeah, the pace of this Taliban offensive really is breathtaking when you see, just how quickly they accelerated their takeover of some of these areas. All right, turning to another topic, Sarah, a judge recently greenlit a defamation case by Dominion Voting Systems against allies of former President Trump. Who are the defendants, and is it possible that some of the recent testimony from the former acting Attorney General could be cited in the case?
Yeah, so former Trump allies, Mike Lindell, that's the MyPillow CEO, Rudy Giuliani, and Sidney Powell, they have all been sued for defamation by the Dominion Voting Systems company, which is a voting machine company. Their claims range from everything from the fact that the company rigged their algorithm to turn votes from President Trump to President Biden, that it was a company created in Venezuela to rig the election then for Hugo Chavez. And these are all publicly made claims that are meant to sway voters to believe that President Trump actually won the election, which of course we know is not true. And President Trump's own Justice Department said themselves that there is not enough evidence to prove that. Now, this isn't the only lawsuit that Dominion is filing. They've also filed a lawsuit against the three big conservative news networks. It's Fox News, OAN, and Newsmax for these same claims that are basically all contributing to this quote unquote big lie, which is that President Trump, rightly won the election, which again is not true. But they're even going so far as to say that he will be reinstated tomorrow on August 13th. We've heard President Trump say that over and over again. We've heard Mike Lindell say that. So again, these are all false claims, and President Joe Biden has been proven to have rightly won the election in 2020.
Well, Meredith, there are newly released comments from a transcript of Rudy Giuliani's interview with the Justice Department back in 2018, where he said it was okay to, quote, throw a fake during campaigns. What was the context of that comment?
Well, this was a conversation that Giuliani had with DOJ Inspector General agents over at the Trump Hotel, and Washington Post was able to obtain a transcript of some of the comments that he made, and Giuliani said it was okay to lie during a presidential campaign. His lawyer texted him that he's under no obligation to tell the truth. But, you know, going off of what Sarah was talking about there with this Dominion lawsuit and the, ongoing talks about election fraud and the falsehood that the election was stolen, Rudy Giuliani is under a lot of legal pressure right now with this lawsuit from Dominion, and he is unable to defend himself. He can't practice law himself. And so stories like this, where he is talking about not telling the truth, or some of the other stories that have come out recently regarding his comments or the former president's comments about the 2020 election, really only undercut his integrity at a time when he's under immense legal pressure.
Immense legal pressure indeed. Well, as we mentioned, former acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen recently testified about pressure from former President Trump to discredit the 2020 election results. The New York Times reports former U.S. Attorney B.J. Pak testified he was forced out for refusing to back Mr. Trump's claims of widespread election fraud. What other justice officials might we actually hear from, Sarah?
Well, we could hear from a number of justice officials, given that the Justice Department did say they would not prevent any former officials from testifying before these two committees in Congress on this issue. And Jeffrey Rosen, the former acting Attorney General, like you mentioned, he testified in a closed-door testimony, in the Senate before the Judiciary Committee. And he, as you mentioned, he said that President Trump was persistent in trying to pressure the Department of Justice to overturn the election results. And he said that Jeffrey Clark, who was at the time the Civil Rights Division head, had a number of unauthorized conversations with the president and may have been joining him in his efforts to make the election seem falsified. Now, again, this is all under investigation. Democrats and Republicans, both in the House Oversight and Senate Judiciary Committee, are investigating whether or not President Trump was obstructing a potential peaceful transfer of power.
Well, Meredith, Politico obtained previously unreleased emails from Justice Department officials discussing voter fraud allegations by the former president. What do those emails show?
Well, those emails show just how under pressure officials at the top levels of the Justice Department were from the Trump White House, from the president himself, over his claims of election fraud. The former president was particularly interested in a video that showed Georgia election workers supposedly putting ballots into a suitcase. That wasn't true, but they were determined to get to the bottom of this. And one thing that I think this sort of highlights is just how consumed the former president was with proving some of these false allegations towards the end of his presidency. And then, of course, how much pressure he was putting on the DOJ, the FBI to try to make these claims a reality in the very end.
Yeah. Meantime, Sarah, in Texas, the state Senate has passed a bill with new voting restrictions after a Democrat filibustered for 15 hours to try to stop the measure. Earlier this week, I asked Texas State Representative Gene Wu if he planned to return to the state capitol. Here's what he said.
Absolutely not. Hell no. I will not be a willing party to the destruction of my own community.
So, Sarah, what could happen next in Texas? What will you be watching for?
I do want to talk about very quickly that filibuster. I think that was really interesting that the Texas state senator, she stood on the floor overnight for 15 hours and said that this was a message to the United States Senate. So while we saw that that Texas Democrat from the House was not intending to return, and this means that they won't have a quorum in Texas to vote because all of these House Texas Democrats are posted up in Washington, D.C., and that is to raise awareness for this voting rights issue. They know that they don't have the votes in the Texas House to actually prevent this bill from being passed. So instead, they're turning their eyes to the national level, and that's the same thing that this Texas state senator did when she was filibustering. She said, this is a message that I want to send to the United States Senate to raise awareness of the importance of the issue of voting rights. So the U.S. the U.S. Senate is trying to pass its own set of voting rights legislation. I think all eyes are going to be at the federal level next to see whether or not they're able to get the number of votes needed to pass any kind of voting rights legislation. There is new legislation coming up, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, but it's all to be said, whether or not they're able to break a filibuster, whether or not they're able to get 60 votes, which is likely not going to happen. But that's kind of what we're all watching next, is whether or not voting rights legislation will be able to be passed at that federal level.
Right. Yeah, I asked Representative Wu about the fact that you had the Senate going on recess the United States Senate going on recess without any progress from his vantage point, and he said that just having the conversation extended was essentially sort of what they were after, because they said, what's the objective here? Can't the governor go ahead and just call another special legislative session? But in his mind and in the mind of other Democrats, their presence outside of Austin, they felt, was really kind of making a statement that would put that pressure on, as you say, for some federal legislation. We'll see. Meridith, finally, the House will be back from summer recess on August 23rd to vote on the $3.5 trillion budget plan. But will Democrats have the votes to pass it?
Well, that's the question. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi can only lose 3 votes here. And while the Senate pushed through the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill, it does have to go through. It needs to be taken up in the House next and over October 23rd and approved there before it's taken back up. And already we've seen some skepticism from people like Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kristen Sinema, who have taken real issue with the size and scope of this, and particularly that pretty hefty price tag. So there's still a lot more negotiating that needs to go on, a lot of conversations, but there's really not a lot of wiggle room here.
All right, so much for a quiet August in Washington. Meridith McGraw, Sarah Mucha, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.